Do you use authentic texts in your language classroom? Now, to make sure that we're all on the same page with this concept, the simple definition is that this is material created by and for native speakers within their culture, and not for the purpose of language learning. These materials reflect real-world language use and cultural context. They expose students to natural language and cultural nuances as well. In this episode, I'll share practical strategies to help students interpret and engage in meaningful ways with these materials. So, are the benefits linguistic, cultural, maybe both? Let's jump in. Are you a language teacher looking for some reassurance that what you're doing in the classroom is on the right track? Or maybe you're looking for some ways to teach even more effectively? If you're one or the other or somewhere in between, you've landed in the right place. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast with your host, me, Joshua Cabral. You're about to get tips, tools, and resources so that your students continue to rise in proficiency and communicate with confidence. Let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mes amis. Hola, mis amigos. Welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast. I am Joshua Cabral, and thank you, as always, for taking the time out of your week to listen to a podcast about language teaching. So today, we are going to explore how to guide our learners to interpret and discuss authentic texts. Now, this is a practice that can significantly enhance our language students' proficiency and cultural awareness. We'll discuss the importance of using authentic texts in the language classroom, and I'll share some practical strategies to help students interpret and engage in meaningful ways with these materials. Before we jump in there, I just want to make sure that you're aware of the CI Toolbox, and you will find the link for the CI Toolbox in the show notes. You can also get it at wlclassroom.com/toolbox. And this includes 15 comprehensible input, CI, activities for your language classroom to support comprehension and authentic engagement with your students. These suggestions are a compilation of ideas that have been shared on the World Language Classroom podcast by me and my many guests. So make sure that you take a second to go on over to wlclassroom.com/toolbox, or you can click the link right in the show notes to get your copy of it. So now that we have that out of the way, let's jump into our discussion about using authentic texts. Now, this is a hot topic right now. A lot of teachers are talking about it. You often see workshops on it at conferences. So this is definitely a topic that is useful for teachers to be talking about and learning about right now. So I'm going to break this down into 5 key strategies, each with concrete tips and examples to help you effectively incorporate authentic texts into your teaching. As I said in the opening, an authentic text is materials created by native speakers for native speakers. That's often what you hear when people talk about this. But I also like to add on that it's within a cultural context, because many times when we are using authentic resources, when students are engaging with them, there is the linguistic part of it because they're engaging with the target language, but it's also reflective of the culture. So it's not just that it's native speakers for native speakers, and that's how they're created. Things like newspapers and blogs, songs, advertisements, videos, all of these reflect real-world language use in a cultural context. So I always like to put that caveat that, yes, these are created within the native speaker realm, but it's because they share a cultural understanding as well. And so when we consider why there is this talk about using authentic text in our classroom and why we should be doing it and how useful it is, it really comes down to this idea that using authentic text exposes our students to natural language and the way the language is being used in a natural and almost organic way amongst speakers that understand each other linguistically as well as in their cultural context. And that's why we have the chance to really dive in. And as we're diving in and discovering those cultural nuances that are within an authentic text, this is also going to help our students develop better comprehension skills along with their cultural awareness. And it also makes learning more engaging and relevant for our students. This concept of guiding learners to interpret and discuss authentic texts is what is referred to as a high-leverage teaching practice because it challenges students to apply their language skills in real-world contexts, and that's fostering this deeper understanding, and also it's honing in on their critical thinking skills. And these high-leverage teaching practices are from Eileen Glisson and Richard Donato, and they come from their book, Enacting the Work of Language Instruction, that was published in 2020. And there are 6 high-leverage teaching practices, and this idea of using authentic cultural resources is just one of the 6. And this is the 4th episode that I have dedicated to the high leverage teaching practices. So in episode 160, I kicked it off with creating a classroom discourse community. And then in episode 162, I looked at facilitating target language comprehensibility. And then in episode 164, it was the grammar episode, and we looked at focusing on form. So this is the 4th, so there are 2 more to come after this. So this is the 4th in the series where we're going to be looking at the high leverage teaching practice of using authentic resources. So let's dive right into our strategies. And as I said, there will be 5 of them. So the first strategy that I'm going to talk about is about selecting an appropriate text. Now, choosing the right text is crucial for student engagement and comprehension. So the text should be relevant to students' interests, but also appropriate for their proficiency level. And that's sometimes where it can become a bit challenging with our authentic resources when it comes down to the proficiency level of our students. And the concept of CI, comprehensible input, and providing comprehensible input to our students, we can sometimes get caught up in finding authentic texts that are not that I+1, that comprehensible input for students, because they can be really challenging and above their level. And so for that reason, we sometimes will avoid them. So I'll revisit this idea of using them specifically for comprehensible input after I go through the 5 strategies. So this first one, selecting appropriate text. It's a challenging one, but as we are choosing this text, which doesn't have to be a written text, it can be a video, it could be something students are reading for sure, it could be images of something, it can be one word to full-on paragraphs. So the word text does not just mean text on paper. It could be really anything that's in the target language in any of the modes. But as we are seeking out and finding these authentic texts, we should consider our students' interests and their own cultural backgrounds when selecting these texts, because this will ensure that they are engaging and relatable to students. Because just as Krashen says with his compelling input hypothesis, we don't want the language to just be comprehensible. It has to be so compelling that students want to engage with it, and they almost forget that it's in the target language because they're so interested in the subject matter. So make sure that you keep that in mind as you're looking for these authentic texts. And when it comes down to the idea of proficiency and the proficiency level of our students, we do want to start with shorter, simpler texts for beginners at that novice level and gradually introduce more complex materials as students' skills improve and they grow in proficiency. And so we want to use a variety of types of text. Is that an article, is that a video, is it an infographic? Because this will cater to the different learning styles of our students and also keep the lessons dynamic. So, for example, for a beginner class, you might choose a weather forecast video in the target language, something on the simpler end, and have students listen and identify key weather terms, then discuss the weather in their own town using similar vocabulary. The great thing about this is the input is comprehensible because it's very visual, because usually when they're talking about weather, they're showing things. I actually do this daily when I do my calendar talks, and we talk about what's the weather today. We pull out of a hat a country, and then we go to that country on Google Maps. We talk about where it is, what surrounds it, and then we make a guess at what the weather might be in that country, and then we actually check it on a website and see what the weather is in the target language, and we talk about what it is, if our assumptions are right, and if they're different, why was it different? Then we get to use numbers when we're talking about the temperature, and then it usually has days of the week on there, so we can bring that in and talk about what the weekend is going to look like, what it looked like last week, what are the trends. And you're also looking at it from that cultural perspective. So all of that is using authentic resources and authentic documents for students to engage in the target language. So it doesn't mean that you are just having students reading to understand and then doing something with it, but you're actually using it as a tool for engagement for students as well. So this idea of the authentic text is just for reading, an assignment, something like that, that students are reading it to understand it and then doing something. That's definitely one way of doing it, but you can use an authentic text or an authentic document as a way to engage students in conversation as well, like the way I do using simply Google Maps when I put it in the target language, and then when we go to a website in the target language to check on the weather. I do the same thing when we talk about the time. What time is it right now? What time do you think it is in the country we just pulled out? What time zone are they in? What's the difference? And then we check and see what time is it actually there. So again, those are cultural documents. Those are authentic cultural documents that we're using to engage in the conversation. So when it comes down to this idea of appropriate text, it's not always that printed on paper that students are reading. It can be used to engage in an activity as well. Now, moving on to strategy 2, this is doing pre-reading activities. So pre-reading activities prepare students for the content and language that they're going to encounter and see and read or hear within the text. So this brings in the idea of activating their prior knowledge and setting a purpose for the reading. So it may be some new vocabulary that you're front-loading, but it's also some retrieval practice where it's vocabulary they've seen, they've heard, they've read, and you're bringing it back up into the forefront of their mind so that they are really listening for, say, family vocabulary, even though you haven't looked at it in a while. But if you do some pre-reading activities where you are bringing up that prior knowledge, it's going to make students be more attentive to it as they're seeing it come up. So we want to introduce key vocabulary and concepts before the reading to help them understand the text better. So using prediction activities, such as showing the title or a picture from the text, and then asking students to predict what they think it will be about, that is a way of doing some retrieval practice and also helping them to predict. And then that makes it a little more compelling for them when they're actually engaging with it, because they're looking to see the answer to what their hypothesis was, what their prediction was. And then as we engage, we want to discuss the cultural context and the text to provide a background knowledge and make sure that the connections that students are making and understanding are accurate, and that you're not creating stereotypes, and that students can connect it to their own experience as well. That's something that is also going to make it compelling. So as they are going through, they are making these predictions, these maybe some assumptions, but once you start going through, go back and say, what did we start with? We talked about family vocabulary. What family words did we hear or see when we were in there? What were their connections? What's the connection to you? What is the cultural significance of that? But once you've done those pre-reading activities where you're doing that retrieval practice and bringing out the vocabulary, then students are going to be more sort of at the ready to be able to discuss them as you're going through. So an example of this might be before reading a news article, so this would be a higher proficiency level. Reading a news article about a cultural festival, you might want to show pictures of the festival and discuss what students know about it. And then through there, you can introduce some key vocabulary related to the event, and then ask students to predict what they think they will learn about as they read about it or as they listen to a video talking about it. Depending on the country that it's in, the area that it's in, they can make those predictions ahead of time and then revisit as you're going through and listening. Now, strategy 3 is guided reading and annotation. So our previous strategies, first off, we looked at finding an appropriate text, whether that's at their proficiency level, of their interest, all those different reasons we want it to be compelling. And then the next strategy was looking at pre-reading or pre-listening or pre-engagement activities. So now we're going to look at guided reading or guided listening and annotation. So guided reading and annotation, this means that students are actively engaging with the text, whether that's highlighting important information, making notes. So this is all going to help to deepen their understanding and also encourage their critical thinking skills. So as we're doing this, we want to teach students how to annotate text by highlighting key points, underlining unfamiliar words, or writing comments or questions in the margins. And we want to make sure that we are pausing periodically during the reading to make sure that students are understanding difficult sections or to even help understand some questions they might have. And as you go through each section, make sure checking for that understanding. Just like when students are listening, you want to check for that understanding, because this is going to encourage students to focus on what they do truly understand, and want to encourage our students to summarize sections that they read or that they listen to of the text in their own words as a way to check for comprehension. So an example of this might be, while you're reading a short story, have students highlight descriptive language and annotate how it contributes to the mood of the story. There might be certain descriptive words. There might be certain descriptive adjectives that are talking about the characters in a certain way or the setting. And pause after each paragraph to discuss students' annotations and to clarify any confusion that might have been coming up. Now, I understand this is a higher level, so I gave an example earlier when we were choosing our text about using the weather as a way of engaging students with an authentic text at the novice level. So this is going to be at a higher proficiency level, that intermediate mid to that intermediate high. I always like to give examples in different proficiency levels because I know teachers teach different languages at different levels. So I just wanted to make sure and add that one in there for you as well. But a lot of the pre-reading and the during reading can span levels just depending on the complexity of the text that students are engaging with. Now, moving on to strategy 4, this is the post-reading activities. So we had our pre-reading after we chose the text that was appropriate for students, and we did some during reading comprehension checks, make sure students are able to revisit their assumptions from the pre-reading. And now we finished the text, so now we want to look at some post-reading activities. Now, these post-reading activities or discussions allow students to share their interpretations, ask questions, and engage in a deeper analysis of the text. Again, more critical thinking, collaborative learning, all of those things. And when we say text, remember, it doesn't have to be a lot of words on a page that students are reading, prose or a novel or something like that. It can absolutely be that, but it can also be a shorter sample of something that is written or something that they're listening to, or even an advertisement or a photo. I tend to take a lot of photos when I'm traveling or if I'm in an area where the target language is used. I take photos all the time of storefronts or signs that I see so that I can use those as authentic resources for my students in the classroom. So as you're having students engage after they have read or listened to the text, we want to make sure that we are using open-ended questions that prompt discussion and encourage multiple viewpoints. Now, at the novice level, these questions, even though they're open-ended, they could be either or. There is no right answer to that. Students could have multiple options. What do you think will happen next? And you give 3 or 4 options, or multiple students give multiple options. So we want to make sure that we have those open-ended questions. The comprehension questions are good while you're engaging with the text to, make sure that they're understanding as you're going through. But when they are engaging with the text after the fact, we want it to be a little more open-ended. Like, what do you think the main message is? Who do you think the audience was for this? Who wrote this? Why did they write it? Who's the person reading this? Where might you see this article? Would this advertisement be in a magazine? Would it be on a website? Would it be in a metro station? So you can ask questions like that help students to engage a little more critically with the text, and they have to actually understand the text globally to answer those sort of questions, but they're not going back in and finding the particular answers that are sort of word level and sentence level. And depending on the level of the class, you could also facilitate small group discussions so that students all have a chance to speak and interact rather than always doing it as a whole class activity. And encourage students to connect the text to their own experience and other texts that they have read. And then the 5th strategy goes even further with extension activities. So we started with choosing the text that is appropriate level, proficiency level, or also looking at the idea that it's a compelling topic for students. We did some pre-reading, and then we did some activities while we're reading and engaging with the authentic text. And then we did some post-reading, more immediate reaction to what they were reading, what they were listening to, what they were engaging with. And so now we're going to look at extension activities. So after all that process is done, now what are students going to do with what they learned? And so extension activities help students apply what they've learned from the text, whether that's listening or reading, to a new context to deepen their understanding. So these types of activities can also make learning way more interactive and fun for our students. So some things we can do as extension activities might be to have students create their own related texts, such as writing a sequel to the story or the next chapter or the lost chapter, or perhaps if you were looking at social media posts, that they could write their own comment based on somebody else's comment that was on there, or they could create their own social media post like on Instagram and they're writing the caption for it, but based on something that they saw in other captions. So having students create their own version of the text that they saw where they're inspired by it, and you can incorporate other creative projects like maybe making a video or drawing a comic strip or performing a skit based on the text. So again, you have to truly understand the text to be able to create something based on it. And this is often going to include things like maybe role play activities where students take on roles of characters from the text or explore different perspectives. If it's something they read, then have them do something that's speaking to engage with it. If it was something that they listened to, then maybe have them do something in writing that is their extension activity. So it's an opportunity to change the modes so that you're not doing the same mode. So if it's something they were reading, have them do an extension activity that's focused on speaking, and vice versa. If it's something they were listening to, have them also maybe speak about it, but write about it as well. So with those extension activities, it gives them that opportunity to extend their learning and to go into the other modes. So to conclude here, now that we have our strategies for engaging with an authentic text, which is one of our high leverage teaching practices, I just wanted to touch upon the idea of comprehensible input and CI. So this is a question, comment, concern that often comes up, and it is the question of texts being too challenging to use in particularly novice level classrooms or even our intermediate level classrooms, intermediate, mid, and high. There are many texts, that authentic texts, that are going to be way too challenging linguistically for our students. And so what I will say to that is that most authentic texts, for me, are used for the embedded culture and real world scenarios. They are not, in my opinion, practical for CI and comprehensible input because they are rarely just above the proficiency level of the students. So that I+1 that Crashton refers to as that comprehensible input realm. So it's challenging to find them. So for me, a lot of times the reason for using authentic text is to pull out the culture and the real world scenarios, but not to use it as a PACE model type activity where students are trying to find grammar structures or use it to co-construct a structure that you're going through or find patterns, because you're rarely going to find that text that has enough examples of it to use it in that context. So there are going to be some authentic texts that you can truly use as a comprehensible input activity, but I find that they are most useful, in my own experience, for using them as a way of learning about cultural nuance and to understand some of the embedded culture that's within it. More so those questions about who wrote it, who is it for, where would you see it, when did this happen, why, all of those questions will help to have students focus on the global understanding and not the specific details. Because if it is too challenging, they're not going to get all those specific details. And I also like to bring it back to the proficiency levels, because even if you have a class that's intermediate mid to intermediate high, going up into that advanced range, and you have a truly authentic, complex text that's way above their proficiency level, we want to be aware of how learners engage with the text. Is it too challenging that they are only looking at single word or sentence level comprehension? So even if you have an intermediate high class and they are engaging with a really challenging authentic text, and you're having them find information that they are looking only at sentence level to find the name of a person or a place, then we're asking them to engage with it at very novice level, which is just sentence level or just word level. So does this prompt students at the intermediate level to engage at the novice level? And if that's the case, I think that it's more beneficial to use a text that is at their proficiency level, that they engage with at their proficiency level. Because if it's too far above, then they're not going to be engaging with it at their proficiency level. Again, in my own experience. And I know that that might be controversial, but I'm willing to put myself out there to say this as well, that maybe modifying the text so that it is comprehensible is making it possible for students to engage. So the authentic text is best used for cultural exposure rather than for comprehensible input. So again, could be controversial, but I like to see my students engage with the language in a way that makes them feel confident and that they actually understand. And if we're only looking for texts that are specifically at their level, that's going to be challenging. We're always going to be using infographics or two-sentence tweets or posts on social media. But if we want students to engage with more language, then I'm okay personally with that idea of maybe modifying a little bit so it's at their proficiency level so that they are able to actually engage with it. Now, I know that there are many thoughts on that. There are even some thoughts out there that make the claim that since we are using an authentic document that is not intended for teaching in a teaching context, is no longer authentic. So we could go round and round and round about this, but I will use this whole comprehensible input, authentic document conversation at the idea that using authentic documents is essential for culture and seeing and hearing language in real world contexts. So use them for that. And if that is the goal and students are able to perhaps find some structures in there as well for comprehensible input, that's great. But sometimes you're going to have those texts that are too challenging, but they're able to pull some cultural nuance out of it. Then you're going to have some that are right at their level where they're going to be great linguistically. You can do some CI and they engage with it, they learn the culture, and they can also find some patterns, a great both and. And sometimes you're going to have those texts that are just too challenging, but it is compelling enough information that maybe modifying it, maybe putting it into an AI tool to modify it for their proficiency level, and they are able to continue working with it and understand it, is linguistically beneficial. And I totally understand, and it's controversial that it is no longer a total authentic document when that happens, but in the end, I like to see my students engaging confidently with the language. So today we explored 5 key strategies for guiding learners to interpret and discuss authentic texts. And that started with selecting the appropriate text, whether that is for compelling reasons for the topic or their proficiency level, using pre-reading activities, and then guided reading and annotation and checking for understanding, then facilitating some post-reading discussions and what are students doing once they've understood the entire thing that they've read or listened to, and then moving on to implementing those extension activities. So incorporating authentic texts into your teaching can be incredibly rewarding for both you and your students, because it's going to make learning more engaging, relevant, and effective, whether you are doing it completely for comprehension and using it for CI, or also using it for those culturally embedded elements as well. So I encourage you, try out some of these strategies in your classroom this week, observe how your students are responding, and then adjust your approach as needed. And always share out your experiences with us all on social media so that we can learn from you and collaborate with each other. Just make sure that you tag me, WL Classroom, at WL Classroom on Instagram and Twitter/X. So one final reminder to download the CI Toolbox, which is in the show notes, or you can go right to wlclassroom.com/toolbox. And this is a document that has 15 comprehensible input activities for your language classroom, and they are a compilation of ideas that have been shared here on the World Language Classroom by me and my many guests. So you'll also see in the show notes the link to sign up for Talking Points, which is my weekly email newsletter with tips and resources for language teaching. And you'll also see the links to get in touch with me if you would like to work together. We can do that either in person in your school or remotely. I am putting together my schedule for the spring at this point from March 1st on, and I do have some openings, so please get in touch and let's start the conversation so that we can work together. Thanks so much. I will talk to you soon. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to the World Language Classroom podcast. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so that you never miss an episode. Let's keep the conversation going on social media. Connect with me on X, aka Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at WL Classroom. And for even more valuable resources, visit my website, wlclassroom.com, where you'll find over 300 blog posts about language teaching. So stay inspired, keep growing, and continue making a difference in your language classroom.